There is a moment in an empath's life that feels almost unreal the first time it happens. A moment when the heart, which has always been open like a temple with its doors unlatched day and night, suddenly closes. Not angrily, not dramatically, just closes. A soft, resolute click. And the world around them, especially the people who depended on that open doorway, feels the shift immediately, even if they can't name it. That inner temple is an image many men quietly resonate with. A life spent sheltering others, absorbing their storms, offering emotional refuge even when no one asks how much weight your walls have been holding. For years, those doors stay open because you believe the illusion most empaths don't recognize until much later in life, that caring this much is strength, responsibility, even moral duty. But beneath that devotion sits a truth few men are ever taught to recognize. A truth that shapes every relationship, every conflict, every moment you feel torn in two. The unconscious mistake many men make is assuming their empathy is limitless because they never learn to feel the cost of it in their own body. They learn to feel everyone else first. That misinterpretation becomes the architecture of their identity. If you were raised with a father or mother whose moods filled the room before they even spoke, you may have absorbed a silent contract. If I stay attentive, if I anticipate their needs, if I sense everything, maybe I can stop the chaos before it starts. What looks like natural sensitivity is often a survival adaptation, formed long before you had words for it. Over time, this adaptation becomes so entwined with your sense of self that exhaustion feels like a personal failure instead of an inevitable collapse. It's a strange kind of loneliness, isn't it? To be the one who notices everything, but rarely feels noticed in return. Many men never name this loneliness because they confuse sensitivity with weakness, or because they were taught that their role is to hold the emotional line, no matter what it costs internally. That pressure becomes its own kind of trauma bond, a cycle fueled not only by attachment, but by the neurochemistry of oxytocin, responsibility, and fear of disconnection. Your body is trained to care as a way to stay safe. You don't perform empathy, you enact a survival script. And yet, every survival script eventually reaches its limit. When an empath finally stops caring, people often react with confusion or even panic. They say you've changed, you've shut down, you've become cold. But what they're actually witnessing is the first emergence of a self that was buried under years of compulsive caretaking. The collapse is not moral failure, it's psychological birth. Here's the tension at the center of this moment. What happens in a relationship when the person who has always carried the emotional weight quietly sets it down? What happens to the system, the dynamics, the expectations, the unspoken roles, when the stabilizer withdraws their stabilizing? For many men, this is the first time they feel themselves separate from the rescuer identity they've worn since childhood. And for the people around them, that separation feels like a crisis because they were accustomed to a version of you that abandoned himself to keep the peace. If you want to test where you are in this process, one subtle experiment is to notice what happens in your body when someone expects more of you than you can give. Do you lean in automatically? Do you freeze? Do you feel the old pressure to repair the emotional field before anyone else notices something is off? That micro-freeze is often the first sign that your system is tired of the old contract. As we move deeper into this journey, we'll explore the shadow contract you never realized you signed, the nervous system rebellion that makes not caring feel like a shock, and the identity collapse that emerges when years of over-responsibility finally dissolve. And midway through, I'll reveal one pattern men almost always overlook, the pattern that predicts the exact moment an empath's empathy begins to collapse. For now, hold this one grounding thought. You are not closing your heart out of cruelty. You are closing the temple doors long enough to hear the sound of your own life again. When we continue, we'll step into the unspoken deal every empath inherits, the deal that shapes everything, until the moment it breaks. There is a moment in every empath's life when they begin to sense that something deeper has been operating beneath their choices, their patience, and even their exhaustion. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic insight. It shows up quietly, as a recognition that the way they care has never been truly free. It has always carried an invisible weight, a condition, a fear. This is where the shadow contract begins to reveal itself. For many men, this contract was written long before adulthood, long before they had the language to describe what they were feeling. It often starts with a child standing in a living room. sensing tension in a parent's voice before the argument starts, or tightening his stomach when the front door opens and he isn't sure which version of the parent is walking in. The body learns to scan, the breath shortens, attention narrows, and in that moment, without realizing it, the child signs an internal agreement. If I sense everything, maybe I can prevent chaos. If I stay attuned, maybe I can stay safe. By the time that child becomes a man, the contract feels like personality rather than adaptation. He believes he is naturally patient, naturally understanding, naturally willing to do the emotional heavy lifting. But underneath that kindness lives a nervous system trained to anticipate rupture before it happens. The world praises his empathy, but few people ever ask whether it was born from freedom or fear. This is where Jung's language helps, not as theory, but as a mirror. What he called the persona, the mask we present to the world, often forms around this contract. The rescuer persona doesn't mean a man is heroic. It often means he learned that caretaking was the safest identity available to him. Behind that mask sits a shadow the empath rarely wants to touch. The younger self who carries the rage, the disappointment, the resentment of always being the stabilizer, while no one stabilizes him. Many men are surprised to discover that caring too much can be a form of control, not intentional, not manipulative, not cruel, but deeply unconscious. When your body has learned that your safety depends on other people staying regulated, your empathy becomes a strategy. You soften your tone to keep the peace. You over-explain to prevent misunderstanding. You absorb discomfort so no one has to confront their own. The intention is compassion, but the mechanism is fear. And this is often where the misunderstanding begins. One quiet reframing is important here. Overgiving is not the opposite of selfishness. It is a response to powerlessness. It is a way of shaping the emotional environment so that danger feels less likely. When men begin to see this, the entire architecture of their relationships starts to shift. They realize that the empathy they're proud of is also the empathy that drains them, that their patience is fueled by hypervigilance, and that their understanding is often a shield against being truly seen. The body often tells the truth first. The empath notices tiny freezes, moments when someone's tone shifts or expectations rise, and the nervous system flinches before the mind rationalizes it. A tightening in the jaw, a flutter in the chest, a subtle urge to leave the room. Neuroscience describes this as dorsal vagal activation, but in everyday terms, it is simply the body saying, "I can't keep absorbing this." The freeze is the first signal that the shadow contract has reached its limit. And when that contract breaks, the empath system doesn't return to the warm, open sensitivity they are used to. It swings instead into clarity, boundary, neutrality, states that feel foreign, even cold, because they are not fueled by fear. To the people around the empath, this clarity often feels like withdrawal. To the empath, it feels like waking up in a body that finally wants to belong to itself. If you want to sense your own shadow contract, one gentle experiment is to notice what happens when someone expresses disappointment in you. Noticing, not fixing, not apologizing, just sensing. Does your stomach drop? Does your mind race? Do you instinctively prepare to repair the rupture? These reactions can become windows into the agreements your younger self made without your adult self knowing. What comes next is a turning point. When the contract dissolves, the empath's system doesn't shut down. It reorganizes. It moves toward a clarity others may misinterpret as coldness, when in truth, it is the first moment of inner sovereignty. And don't skip what follows, because 2 topics ahead we will examine a cross-cultural story where a man's empathy collapse didn't destroy him, it rebuilt him. There comes a point in an empath's life when the mind tries to continue the old pattern, but the body simply won't cooperate anymore. It happens subtly at first. You may still speak gently, still offer understanding, still step into the familiar role. But inside, something feels different. The energy that once rushed forward to soothe, interpret, or stabilize is no longer there. What rises instead is a quiet resistance, not anger, not avoidance, just a refusal from deep within. This is the moment when the nervous system begins its rebellion. For years, many empaths have lived with a body that equates stillness with danger. When there is no tension to manage, no emotional signal to decode, no one to take care of, the system feels strangely exposed. Peace becomes unfamiliar. calm, becomes unsettling. A man raised in emotional unpredictability often internalizes this pattern so deeply that he confuses vigilance with love. A relationship with intensity feels alive. A relationship without it can feel strangely empty, and without realizing it, he becomes addicted to the emotional labor itself. A clinician once described this as emotional labor addiction, a cycle where the empath feels responsible for others because his nervous system has been trained to expect crisis. Not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle background hum of anticipation. It is the body's way of preparing for the next emotional wave before it arrives. From a biological perspective, this cycle is reinforced by years of oxytocin and dopamine surges that accompany emotional caregiving. In trauma-bonded dynamics, this chemical loop creates tolerance. The empath needs more intensity to feel connected, more conflict to feel necessary, more emotional responsibility to feel valued. So when the cycle finally breaks, through burnout, distance, or sheer depletion, the absence of stimulation doesn't feel like relief. It feels like numbness. This numbness is often where men misinterpret their experience. They say, "I think I've stopped caring," but what they are actually experiencing is the first moment their system isn't being hijacked by the emotional climate around them. The numbness is not apathy. It is the nervous system resting for the first time in years. Peace is not boring. It is the body remembering that safety does not require constant vigilance. There is a reframing here that can shift an entire lifetime of misunderstanding. The empath doesn't stop caring because they are cold. They stop caring because their body finally understands it can't keep living in overdrive. When the nervous system stops operating through survival, the entire architecture of empathy changes. It becomes quieter, slower, more deliberate. This new form of empathy often feels like detachment to people who benefited from the old pattern. But it is not detachment, it is differentiation. Culture sometimes confuses intensity with connection. In the film Whiplash, the relationship between student and mentor is built entirely on emotional extremes. The student mistakes the relentless pressure and turmoil for a meaningful bond. But when the intensity stops, the relationship collapses because there was nothing underneath it. Many empaths repeat this dynamic without realizing it. They interpret chaos as depth and quiet as distance. When the chaos disappears, they question the relationship rather than questioning the pattern. As the body continues its rebellion, the empath begins to sense a shift in identity. The old rescuer role feels too heavy. The old compliance feels unnatural. The nervous system no longer permits automatic caretaking. This is both liberating and disorienting. The people who relied on the empath's emotional availability may interpret this shift as indifference, but it is simply the body reclaiming its boundaries. If you want to explore this shift within yourself, one gentle experiment is to notice what your body does in moments of calm, those rare instances where no one needs anything from you. Do you relax, or do you feel uneasy? Do you search for something to fix? Does your mind drift towards someone else's problem because silence feels too open? These sensations can reveal how deeply the old survival pattern shaped your relationship with empathy. What emerges next is the beginning of an identity rupture. When the nervous system no longer supports the rescuer role, the old self-image starts to dissolve. And this dissolution is precisely what causes others to panic. Not because the empath becomes distant, but because the familiar dynamic they depended on begins to unravel. In the next chapter, we will explore what happens in relationships when this withdrawal of emotional labor creates a power vacuum, when the empath steps back and everyone else's unhealed patterns rush forward to fill the space. When an empath steps back, sometimes quietly, sometimes without fully understanding why, something unexpected happens in the relational field. The silence they create is not neutral. It is a shift in gravity. For years, their steady emotional presence acted as the anchor that held conversations, conflicts, and entire relationships in balance. When that anchor lifts, even gently, a vacuum forms. And in that vacuum, the truth of the dynamic finally appears. Most empaths underestimate just how much emotional regulation they provide for the people around them. They assume their grounding is simply kindness or personality or maturity. But often, they have been carrying a hidden stabilizing role, the one who softens tensions, the one who interprets moods, the one who anticipates needs before they are voiced. This labor is rarely acknowledged, yet relationships quietly depend on it. When it's withdrawn, the system buckles. Others may accuse the empath of being distant or selfish, but those reactions usually reveal something deeper. Without the empath's constant regulation, people are left with their own unprocessed emotions: frustration, insecurity, fear, projection. The empath was not just supportive, they were a buffer between others and their own shadows. When the buffer disappears, the shadow rushes to the surface. A man once described withdrawing from a codependent relationship not with hostility, but with simple clarity. He stopped cushioning every emotional outburst. He stopped explaining himself 3 different ways just to avoid misunderstanding. He stopped rearranging his life around someone else's storms. And immediately the accusations began. You're being cruel. You're shutting me out. You've changed. But nothing cruel had happened. What changed was that her emotional instability had nowhere left to land. This is where a deeper reframing can occur. Others react not to the empath's absence, but to the loss of the emotional leadership they depended on. Behavioral science calls part of this dynamic the halo effect. When someone is consistently generous, consistently patient, consistently forgiving, they are idealized. People assume they can never disappoint, never push back, never break the pattern. The empath becomes a symbol rather than a person, and symbols are easier to misuse. When the halo collapses, the projection reverses. The same qualities that were praised become grounds for blame. Not because the empath has changed, but because the illusion can no longer be maintained. The person who once said, "You're the only one who understands me," begins to say, "You're so cold now," because they never learned to hold their own emotional weight. Here is a reframing that often lands with a quiet shock. The empath was the emotional leader of the relationship all along, just a leader without boundaries. Leadership doesn't always look dominant. Sometimes it looks like quiet responsibility that others take for granted. When that leadership is withdrawn, people are forced to confront the parts of themselves they avoided by leaning on the empath. And this shift reveals something even more destabilizing. If the empath is no longer the caretaker, the mediator, the absorber of tension, who are they? What remains when the familiar role dissolves? For many men, this question is both frightening and liberating. Frightening because the old identity falls apart. Liberating because the pressure to hold everything together finally releases. If you want to explore this dynamic internally, one option is to notice what happens inside you after you offer a boundary or a moment of silence. How do others react? How does your body react? Does tension rise? Does guilt appear? Do you feel tempted to rush back into the old role? These sensations reveal exactly how deeply the power structure was built around your emotional labor. And as this new space opens, so does the next challenge. When you are no longer defined by caretaking, your identity begins to fracture and reorganize. This marks the midpoint of the empath's journey, where the collapse of the old good person persona makes room for something more grounded, more honest, and far more sustainable. In the next chapter, we will step into this identity collapse and explore what breaks and what finally begins to rebuild. There is a point in every empath's journey when the external dynamics are no longer the main source of tension. The real turning point arrives within. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, when the familiar identity, the one built around patience, generosity, and emotional availability, no longer fits. The man who once prided himself on being understanding finds that understanding has become heavy. The man who once felt noble in sacrificing his needs begins to notice the emptiness behind that nobility, and without warning, the persona cracks. This persona, often shaped by the good boy archetype, is not about morality in a philosophical sense. It is morality as self-protection. Many men learn very young that being agreeable keeps the peace, that being patient prevents conflict, and that being the good one shields them from rejection. Goodness becomes less of value and more a survival strategy. The cost of this strategy is invisible at first. Over time, it becomes suffocating. The collapse of this persona is not dramatic. It is not a sudden transformation. It feels more like the fading of a role that can no longer be performed. A man may notice he does not have the energy to soothe someone else's insecurity. He may realize that the words of reassurance he once gave so effortlessly now feel forced. He may even experience a strange neutrality where there used to be urgency. This neutrality is often misinterpreted as coldness, but it is something far more important: the first moment of autonomy. Self-determination theory can bring clarity here. Psychological health depends on autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Many empaths live in relatedness overload. They are attuned to everyone else's emotions, but starved of their own agency. They are competent at comforting others, but unsure how to meet their own needs. Their autonomy is sacrificed in the name of harmony. So when the body begins reclaiming that autonomy, the empath feels both disoriented and relieved. Here is a reframing that tends to land with quiet force. Not caring is not cruelty. It is the first act of choosing yourself without apologizing for existing. This is often the sentence that makes a man pause the video because he recognizes the truth immediately, not in his mind, but in his bones. He realizes he has lived years, sometimes decades, measuring his worth by how useful he is to others. The collapse of the good person persona is not the loss of kindness. It is the loss of self-abandonment dressed as kindness. Certain internal signals often accompany this shift. A flatness in effect, not depression, but a reprieve from overreactivity. A reduced need to justify decisions. A sudden preference for solitude because solitude, for the first time, feels spacious rather than isolating. These signals can confuse the empath because they do not match how he imagines personal growth should feel. Instead of inspiration, there is quiet. Instead of excitement, there is clarity. Instead of emotional intensity, there is an absence of urgency. If you want to sense whether you are in this stage, one gentle experiment is to notice your emotional response when someone tries to pull you back into the role that once defined you. Do you feel guilt rushing in? Do you feel anger rising? Do you feel nothing at all? Each of these reactions marks a different phase of the identity shift. The important part is not to force meaning, but simply to notice the sensations that appear when the old role is no longer available. Once this identity fracture begins, something paradoxical happens. The empath's neutrality is misread as power. People accustomed to your self-erasure may believe you have suddenly become dominant or rigid, but neutrality is not power over others. It is power returned to the self, and this return destabilizes every role that kept the old dynamic in place. As we move forward, the story will broaden. We will explore how this new inner structure, this quiet autonomy, creates an unexpected form of strength. The empath's emotional landscape shifts again, but this time towards something grounded, sustainable, and far less reactive. And 2 chapters ahead, the survivor story promised earlier will illustrate how this midpoint collapse becomes the foundation for an entirely new identity. The next chapter begins with this new phase, the empath's unexpected power surge, when emotional neutrality becomes a form of leadership. There is a stage in the empath's journey when the collapse of the old identity doesn't lead to weakness, withdrawal, or emotional vacuum. Instead, something emerges that feels almost unfamiliar, yet deeply stabilizing. It begins as a quiet sense of separation between your emotional field and the emotions of others, an internal distinction that may have felt impossible in the past. Where you once absorbed every shift in tone and every unspoken need, there is now space, and in that space, a new form of power begins to form. This power does not resemble dominance or stoicism. It is not the hardened shell of someone who refuses to feel. It is something subtler. The awakening of the inner masculine, what Jung described as the animus in its mature expression. It is the part of you that no longer dissolves on contact with other people's emotions. It is the part of you that stays intact. You begin to sense the difference between empathy and enmeshment, between care and fusion. Where you once merged, you now observe. Men often describe this phase as feeling strangely taller inside themselves, not in an inflated way, but in a grounded, rooted way. They speak more slowly. They react less quickly. They feel less obligated to explain what is already clear. And this shift is not psychological alone. It is neurological. Every time you set a boundary, every time you allow someone to experience their own feelings without intervening, every time you choose silence instead of over-explaining, you are rewiring the predictive coding of your brain. The nervous system, through neuroplasticity, begins to learn that other people's emotions are not emergencies. The old pattern predicted danger whenever someone was disappointed, upset, or dysregulated. The new pattern predicts continuity. I remain myself even when others feel disrupted. This updated prediction is what gives rise to the empath's unexpected power surge. It is not force. It is not control. It is the absence of fear in the presence of emotional intensity. Here is a reframing that often surprises people around you. Emotional neutrality is not a lack of caring. It is the first honest form of caring. It removes the performance of empathy. It removes the compulsion to fix. It removes the rescuing that came from fear rather than choice. When neutrality appears, people who relied on your emotional labor may interpret it as dominance or detachment. They may say you've changed, or become cold, or stopped trying, but nothing cold is happening. What they are witnessing is a man who no longer sacrifices his inner stability for external harmony. This stage is often illuminated through stories. A man from a collectivist culture once described spending years as his family's emotional caretaker, the mediator, the explainer, the one who absorbed disappointment so others wouldn't fight. When he began to step away from that role, he didn't confront anyone. He simply stopped being available for emotional dumping at midnight. He stopped offering elaborate reassurance when silence would have sufficed. He stopped cushioning the discomfort that others never learned to hold. His family saw this shift as rebellion at first. They interpreted his neutrality as disloyalty, but inside he experienced something entirely different: dignity. He could finally differentiate between love and obligation, between respect and self-erasure. Over time, some relationships adjusted to his new stance. Others did not. But his identity, once built on emotional responsibility, began to restructure around self-respect rather than self-sacrifice. If you want to sense this transition within yourself, one reflective option is to notice how your body responds after a boundary holds. Not the moment you express it, but the aftermath. Does your chest stay open or tighten? Do you feel grounded or uneasy? Do you sense clarity or guilt? These sensations map the nervous system's learning process. Over time, the guilt fades and the clarity strengthens. The system realizes the world doesn't collapse when you remain yourself. The fragility of this new power is important to name. Without integration, neutrality can harden into cynicism. The man can confuse distance for strength. He may retreat too far and lose the relational warmth that once defined him. But with awareness, neutrality becomes a foundation rather than a wall. Empathy returns, but now it is a choice rather than a reflex. It is no longer a payment for safety, but an expression of sovereignty. In the final chapter, we will bring this journey home. What it means for an empath to return to themselves, not as a rescuer or a caretaker, but as a grounded individual whose compassion is rooted in freedom. There is a moment near the end of this journey when the empath stops looking outward for confirmation and turns inward with a kind of steady recognition. Not triumph, not detachment, something quieter. Something like a river returning to its natural course after years of spilling beyond its banks. For a long time, the empath's emotional boundaries flooded outward, nourishing landscapes that were never theirs to tend. People built their expectations on that overflow. They planted their needs close to the river's edge. They assumed the water would keep coming, because it always had. But a river cannot flood forever. When it finally pulls back to its rightful banks, the shift feels profound.
To those who depended on the overflow, the retreat looks like loss. To the river, it is restoration. This is the deeper truth many empaths discover only after the collapse. They were never meant to live in a state of emotional excess. They were never meant to source stability for everyone around them. What looked like compassion was often self-abandonment disguised as virtue.
And when that self-abandonment ends, the world reacts, not because the empath has lost their heart, but because the relational balance has changed. Here is the reframe that closes this arc. The empath didn't stop caring. They stopped caring in a way that cost them themselves. This distinction matters. Caring is not meant to erode identity. Caring is not meant to override intuition. Caring is not meant to be a form of self-erasure. When an empath returns to themselves, the quality of their empathy transforms. It becomes cleaner, steadier, and more truthful. This is the payoff of the entire journey. Empathy becomes a choice, not a compulsion. Presence becomes leadership, not sacrifice. Boundaries no longer feel like walls, but like the natural edges of a life aligned with its own values. The empath's nervous system, once shaped by hypervigilance, begins to trust neutrality. Their identity is no longer organized around keeping others calm. Their emotional life becomes spacious enough for their own needs, their own voice, their own growth. Jung spoke of individuation as the process of becoming who you were meant to be beneath the roles you inherited. This journey, moving from compulsive caretaking to conscious sovereignty, is one expression of that process. The collapse of caring was never the breaking point. It was the initiation, the beginning of a life where compassion is anchored, not extracted, where attunement flows from groundedness, not fear, where the empath's heart remains open, but the doors of the temple open and close at a rhythm that honors the person within. If you want to reflect on where you are in this journey, one gentle option is to notice a single signal that stood out to you while listening. Perhaps the micro-freeze, the shift into neutrality, the quiet relief in setting one boundary, or the feeling of spaciousness when you stopped performing emotional labor. These signals often speak more truthfully than thoughts. If anything in this story mirrored your own experience, sharing even one of those signals can help others recognize what they've been living through, sometimes for years without language.